All right, we're recording. This is office hours for service APIs, May 20, 2020. Lots of 20s today. We have some things on the agenda that I do want to get to. Looks like we've got plenty to cover, but just while we wait, we actually have a pretty good turnout now. Well, now that we have just about everyone, I'm not sure who added this first item here, walkthrough of exposing HTTPS microservices with different ingress controllers. I think we talked about that. Is anyone prepared to share how it works with their particular ingress controller?
I added that in the spirit of volunteering other people to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do remember us discussing it last week, and I think that there was consensus that it's a good idea to help us try to get unstuck with TLS support for the project.
Yeah. Is anyone prepared to discuss how that works for their specific implementation?
So when it says ingress controller here, are we talking about like ingress, or are we talking about the gateway, or are we talking about the actual config that it got compiled to?
Yeah, my understanding was is that it is for ingress. I think most of the implementers are using custom resources instead of ingress. So I put a link there for OpenShift because we use a route custom resource. We have a controller that converts an ingress object to a route object. And one of the things here is that we support either what you see here on the screen, where you can create a route and specify the termination type, like re-encrypt here, or edge, where edge would be, right, the TLS connection gets terminated at the ingress controller and then is just TCP between the ingress controller and the backend. But one of the things we support too is we have a custom resource called an ingress controller that's used by our operator to manage instances of ingress controllers. And if you create a route here and you specify that, you give it some kind of TLS config, but you don't specify certificate information, as we see here with this example, is the route will use the default certificate configured on the ingress controller. It's kind of like a backup. So it kind of gives you the flexibility of both. Is, hey, you could either create a route, specify all your cert information here, or if you want not to do that, you can use the ingress controller's default certificate and make it a little bit easier for the developer.
I'm curious, what else does the ingress controller resource do in this model?
Things like a user can specify the number of replicas they want for the ingress controller. It can specify a domain, the domain's used. So let me actually pause for a second and types ingress controller, and I'll put this in the document as well. Give me 1 second, please. And you can take a look at that as well, or types. 1 second, and show you the route type as well.
Oh, interesting. So, Daniel, like, how does this map to the new API? Is this a class or a gateway or somewhere
Yeah,
between?
yeah, I think it's going to be a combination of the two. So what we use as an ingress controller would be the combination of the gateway and the gateway class. And certain issues that we've created where we've gotten feedback on things like replicas, where we say, oh, that's really an implementation specific. That's where we'd pass that into gateway class as parameters. And then here's the route to API and route. And link to the route. But going back to Ingress Controller.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting config here. This is a good reference.
So let's see here. So yeah, with the Ingress Controller custom resource, right, we specify a domain, and I think the docs kind of dive into what we use the domain for. And I believe we do have an issue to address this in the Service APIs project. But you can see that domains is used for things like a load balancer service endpoint publishing strategy, used for generating the default certificate, because we generate a wildcard default certificate for the domain you specify. And again, that's used so that if a route doesn't specify a certificate, this is kind of the fallback certificate if the route specifies a TLS config without actually providing the cert. Number of replicas, endpoint publishing strategy, right? Because we run the Ingress controller, it's an HA proxy implementation, and we run it as a deployment. And based on what the environment is that it's being deployed in, we're going to have different endpoint publishing strategies, right? So if the cluster's on bare metal, we're going to expose the Ingress controller differently than what we'd do on a cloud provider. I already talked about the default certificate.
Daniel, which endpoints
yeah.
are these? Are these the endpoints for the HA proxy or for
the
the
HA proxy
controller
pods?
itself?
Yeah, right. So how do we want? So if we create an Ingress controller, we say replicas 2, we're going to spin up a deployment for HA proxy consisting of two pods, and how we expose the the networking for those pods will depend on the endpoint publishing strategy, and an endpoint publishing strategy is set based on the environment that the cluster is being run in.
I see. So in this API documentation, I should interpret when I say the Ingress controller terminology is used to refer to both the controller and the proxy as a single unit.
Yeah, because the Ingress controller, again, it's just basically managing the HA proxy as a deployment.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
I see. And then if you create multiple of these, it will create multiple deployments. So it's kind of like a meta Ingress controller almost.
Yeah, I mean, when you create an OpenShift, right, an OpenShift cluster, we do a bunch of stuff by default. One of the things we do is say, okay, we're going to set up Ingress for you. So we have an Ingress controller named default, and the attributes of that default Ingress controller are going to be based on some of the other cluster configuration parameters. And one of the big ones is, well, what kind of cluster, where is this cluster running? Is it on a cloud provider? Is it on bare metal? Is it on libvirt? So on and so forth. And so our Ingress operator is going to look at some of those other resources to go ahead and say, okay, let's go ahead and create this default Ingress controller with certain attributes. And you can create multiple Ingress controllers, right? So if you want, you get a new group that says, we don't want to use the default Ingress controller. Okay, we'll create Ingress controller foo and look at all the things you can set via the spec of the Ingress controller to meet your needs. If you want to continue to use the default Ingress controller, or no matter what the Ingress controller is, typically developers are going to be just interfacing with the route API, creating a route, setting the host. So this is when we say the host of a route, right? This is analogous to what we're doing with Ingress. Host name or service API is the HTTP route host. We also have a subdomain attribute where we can go ahead and say, not only create the host name, but create a subdomain for the host as well. Typical path attribute, the TLS config. I think Micaiah, if you're on, do you want to add anything? Because I mean, you know these APIs even better than I do.
I'm curious. I know that when I looked at this, it's possible to have conflicts in the routes. Is that true?
Yes. So if a user created a conflict on you got route foo that's is created, you then check the status and you see that it's been admitted by the Ingress controller. You'd see that let's say it's admitted by Ingress controller default. So okay, now it should be functional, right? And I should be able to hit that host. If I create route bar and it has a conflict with the host name, we're not going to admit that, because we're going to say, well, that host name is associated to an admitted route foo, so we're not going to admit route bar because of the host name conflict.
I see. Where is that signal? That's on the route itself, or it's part of the Ingress controller status?
It's part of the route status. So if we go to, let's see, where's status?
Is my audio working now?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Great, thanks. And one of our motivations with the Ingress Controller API was to make it really, really easy to create shards or other use cases with multiple Ingress controllers, such as one external facing and one for inside the cluster for internal clients. So when you create a route, if you have multiple Ingress controllers, they'll all show up in this slice here in the route status, the slice Ingress. And that slice will report for each Ingress controller whether the route has been admitted by that Ingress controller, and if so, the host of the route and the canonical name for the Ingress controller, so that you know where to point your CNAME if your route is exposed under multiple load balancers.
Interesting. How have people found this, given we're doing something similar, but probably putting it on a different resource? Like, what I mean is in terms of, have they found it easy to understand conflicts, or was there something that we should be watching out for when we design service APIs? Like any kind of things that you've learned from people using this?
We've had good experience with the Route API. On that subject, I will mention that. So we added Route. We defined the Route API long before Ingress was defined, and we defined an Ingress to Route controller, as Dane mentioned. Once Ingress became popular, we added that controller to translate Ingress to routes. And there are a couple impedance mismatches. For example, with path being a regex. In our case, path is just a string, and we're doing like a prefix match. If you treat it as a regex, and I think we've talked about this before, it becomes really difficult to determine whether you have a conflict. It's difficult to determine that two routes that specify paths and use regular expressions to specify their paths to determine whether those two routes conflict. So that's
I see. So you guys actually compare the path as well when you're talking about conflicts. It's not just based on the host. Oh
yeah, right. Yeah, if you have two routes and they try to claim the same route, same path, or if you have, for example, say a pass-through route that claims a host, and then you have an edge route that tries to claim a path on that host. Well, that's not possible to realize, and so we'll say that this conflicts. You can't, if you have a pass-through for the host, then we're not even looking at the request. We're just passing through the TLS connection. So you can't create an edge route that uses the same host and the path. That's a conflict. Or if you have two edge routes, both claiming the path /foo on the same host, that's a conflict, and we'll report it in the status, and only admit the older of the two routes.
So how do you resolve that conflict? Do you look at the observe generation or the creation time or something like that?
I believe we look at the UID.
Right. Okay, yeah, because I had looked into I've talked to people about having first writer wins conflict resolution for contour stuff as well, and I sort of looked at it for a while and threw up my hands and was like, eventual consistency makes this very difficult.
Yeah, I see. So because you compare the UID, it's possible that someone creates a new one and that one wins, and then other times they'll create it and then it won't because it's just because of the UID for type breaking?
Theoretically, yeah. Yeah, I don't think there's any guarantee that the older one will have a lower UID. Generally, that's the case, but yeah, there's the potential. But if you've created a route and then some significant amount of time later, say a day later, someone else creates a route, it's extremely unlikely that the second route will have a lower UID. It's just if you're creating two at about the same time, you may have, you can't say for sure which one will end up with the lower UID.
Yep.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that the UID had a loose time sequencing when you're comparing them.
Yeah, we're treating it as a vector clock, which might be kind of off-label use, but so far, I don't think we've had any issues with that.
Right. Interesting to know. Thanks. Yeah, I'd basically put it in the requires admission controller basket to be the thing that coordinates which one makes it in.
That might be a better solution. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think admission control is the right solution there. But it does add a lot of complexity to your implementation, because then you're also stuck dealing with admission control and all of the things that come along with it. Like, if you want to uninstall, having a broken admission controller can break your cluster and stuff like that.
All right,
cool.
This has been very helpful. Are there any last thoughts on this implementation?
I think this is really nice. I'm really impressed. Looking at this, I know Daniel talked about an operator for contour, and generally the install for contour is traditional YAML stuff. So this clarifies to me a lot about the kinds of things Daniel had in mind there. So I'm really impressed. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's very useful too. Thank you. And Bowie, I guess that really shows what when James added it in. This is the exact sort of thing that we were talking about, having maintainers of different ingress controllers being currently implemented ingress controllers, and figuring out whatever it is they do to do the sorts of things that we want the service APIs to do. And that way, by the idea being by having more concrete examples to give us more, to bring us all closer to the same model in our heads of how all this stuff works, so that then when we're talking about it, we can make sure that we're doing so in a non-impedance mismatch kind of way.
I did totally drop the ball on organizing people and asking for people's time on this, though.
It's okay. We'll do it bit by bit. I think this is very interesting, and I'm glad that it seems like some of the concepts are aligned, which means we're not too far off in the weeds in the proposal. I'll let Damien comment.
I think the biggest difference I'm seeing right now, Bowie, is again, if we go back to that first link, which is kind of the web kind of user-facing instructions, is right now we're kind of providing the best of both worlds. I think most developers are just going to create a route and then go ahead and say, yep, I want it to TLS config, the termination type, and here's my certificate information, right? But we also have the ability to say, okay, I'm fine using the wildcard certificate of the ingress controller that is responsible for my routes. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, here's the route, create the route, here's the TLS config, and not actually provide, say the termination type is edge or re-encrypt, but not actually provide any of the TLS assets. And I think that's kind of the gap that I'm still trying to figure out how we resolve.
Yeah, in service APIs, because of the split between the gateway and the routes, one of the things I've struggled with there is there's not really a good way for the application owner to express intent. So you have your routes and you say, oh, here they are, but it's hard to see where that application owner expresses their intent for this. I want this to be encrypted. It's this assumption of some kind of out-of-band communication, which isn't very it's just assumed, I guess.
Yeah, this is makes it pretty concrete what is possible with the OpenShift stuff.
I did remember just now one other thing with our API that maybe you can learn from is we realized having the host in the spec is not ideal sometimes for some use cases when it comes, for example, to sharding. And we considered adding, instead of host, or as an alternative to specifying host, allowing you to specify subdomain. And then if you have your route under multiple shards that have different domains, you get a host based on the route's subdomain plus the ingress controller's domain. We didn't end up implementing that, but that's something you might want to consider for Ingress v2 or for service APIs.
So you mean that there is a top level, and then when you attach your subdomain? Is it something like that?
Right. I think that's sort of how, isn't that how Contour's HTTP proxy resource works? You can specify, well, what we were thinking for OpenShift was we would let you specify a subdomain, and yeah, it would be a domain under the ingress controller's domain. And if your route is under multiple ingress controllers, you end up with a host name that is a common subdomain, and then your ingress controller's domain, which will vary across different ingress controllers, different shards, or what have you.
Interesting. And then that it would have to interact with the DNS in some way. Do you guys use like you would provision it somehow, or it's up to the implementation to understand that?
I'm not sure what you mean. Yeah, well, usually with OpenShift, you specify, or often you'll just let the API default the host, and it will default a host that's under the cluster's ingress domain. And then that will be underneath the ingress controller's domain, and we set up a wildcard DNS and wildcard certificate to handle anything under that domain. So any route where you don't specify a host, you get a default host that matches the default ingress controller's certificate and DNS configuration.
I see. I meant sort of provisioning like foo.myingress.com when you request foo. Did you guys have a system that coordinates pushing those records, or it's sort of up to the user in some other system?
Oh, you have the option of either.
Since this, I see.
Yeah, you can take advantage of the wildcard DNS record and certificate that we configure, or you can set your own custom host, but then it's up to you to configure a CNAME record and provide a matching certificate on your route.
Interesting. Cool.
This has been really helpful. Is it worth planning on doing one of these every office hours until we run out of implementations, or is that too much of a commitment?
That sounds good to me.
And any volunteers? I know we have plenty of implementations represented here. Anyone want to volunteer for next week?
I volunteer Nick to do Contour.
I was about to say
Perfect.
I can do work, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Great, thanks. And Daniel, I saw you dropped an issue in here in chat. If you can just give the context on this.
I think we were talking about conflicts on hostname.
Okay, that's right. Okay, and so all right, thank you.
Oops, sorry,
Cool.
I hit stop video instead of unmute.
No.
But yeah, that was it. We were talking about some of the uniqueness constraints, and I just wanted to make everyone aware that we still have this issue out here that we eventually need to solve.
All right, well, I think, I'd added something to the agenda to talk about multi-cluster and traffic splitting, but before we get into that, I wanted to give a bit of an opening here. If anyone had issues or pull requests that could use some attention, any requests to go over one or issue or PR?
I probably have some, but I've just been so tied up with other things the last week that I don't even know what the state is.
So yeah, you have a couple with LGTM now. I know at least the biggest one got in last week, and I think what's left might have conflicts unless it's been rebased since. No, I guess no conflicts here.
Okay, I will take a look and try to merge those.
Okay.
Yeah, the one you just looked at, that was super easy, and I think that's
Yep.
important to get just in case someone wants to do the make install. Without that, it fails.
Great, and I know, James, you had a relatively large PR here, and if I understood correctly, you pulled the host name change back out of this. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I updated it yesterday and tried to address some of the concerns that people raised. I still need to go through and write some example YAMLs. I thought that was a great suggestion. So I need to go through and try and actually write some configurations using this scheme, and I think that'll give people a pretty good idea about how it would play out in practice. but the main change here is that in the new listener definition, the host name is now a match structure. So instead of just being a string, it's now, you now have a match type and a match value. And the match type is either exact or domain. If it's exact, it's full hostname match. If it's domain, then it's a wildcard match. And if the match is absent, then it's a default like thing. The rules of how you collapse, the rules to collapse this thing into virtual services then become like a little bit more verbose, but they can still be, you know, explained.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'll have to take a closer look at this after. Thanks for updating this.
Yeah, I think one thing is, hopefully my audio is okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, one thing is, James, when you do the examples, we probably want to put one L4 in there, because I think this came up in the context of some L4 stuff as well.
Yeah, okay, I'll do an L4 and a few other, and then a bunch of HTTP ones.
Maybe James, if you do a L4 like pass through SNI routing style one and L4 like random port style one.
There's no,
No?
I could do that. You can't do SNI pass through. There's no way to specify that.
Okay.
Yet.
So,
I think eventually there will. I mean, eventually we obviously need that, but
yeah. Well,
I don't think there's a way to kind of do that in service APIs now, and I haven't tried to tackle that in this particular PR.
Okay, that's fine. Then yeah, just if you just do like a random port kind of one, then that would be good.
Cool, I can do that.
What does random port mean?
I mean like something that's not HTTP.
Oh, okay. I thought it was like, oh, you get a random port. Like
No. It's not. Sorry, it's not. You get a random port. It is you request a specific port that is not HTTP. Sorry, I meant random.
Okay, all right.
So
that
it's
makes
just
sense.
listen. So it's basically listen on a port and forward traffic.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
All right, I think the
Okay.
rest of
Yeah, that's good progress. Sorry, the audio is really laggy.
that's fine. The rest of the pull requests, I think we've already looked at in previous meetings, so I think most of them just need a little bit of follow-up and or approval. But there were a few issues that came in the past week that I wanted to cover. This one is very self-explanatory. We just need to document what core, extended, and custom support levels mean. I think we all thought it was in the docs, and it's not yet. So I just created a tracking issue for that. Harry created this issue. Harry, you're on the call. Do you want to give a bit of background on this one?
Yeah, sure. So in the last, was it office hours? Or, yeah, in the last office hours, we discussed around, I think it was one of Danian's PR, where we discussed around how retries and some connection timeout logic was being put inside the route object, like I mean the HTTP route object. So that sparked a discussion in the call, like, these are all service level properties and how multiple proxies define these things inside ingress like resources, or like HTTP route or Knative's implementation or any other implementation. So the reason everyone does that is because there is no place to put these configurations around load balancing, health checking from a reverse proxy or a load balancing perspective, and timeout or retry behaviors, or even protocols. Protocol is a little bit solved with app protocol being introduced in 1.18. So this issue is sort of, Bowie asked, like, let's document this in one issue and then track it. And this probably will help, as we are refactoring the service itself. So this sort of tracks all issues around configuration, which should be a per service configuration, but we currently do not have any location to place it. So it is not exhaustive currently, but it provides, some at least 3 or 4 buckets, of, so there's load balancing, there's health checking, and there's like connection properties, so like a timeouts and retry behaviors at L4, L7.
Yeah, I think like this is one where it's easy to, or you can think of it pushing up and down, but I think at where it currently lives for most implementations is kind of awkward if we leave it, if we push it above service. It almost seems like it should be one-to-one with service. So this is a great survey.
Yes, because while implementing the ingress control for Kong, what we realize is we want to represent a service in Kubernetes as a service in Kong. Kong also has a concept of service, which is very similar to sort of an upstream in Nginx or an upstream pool. Now, what happens is if you define these configurations in multiple ingress resources, what you run into is conflict. So what if one ingress resource defines an upstream timeout of 5 seconds, while the other one defines 1 second? Like, which one do you satisfy? And it gets very hard to signal to the user like which properties take effect. Either you do that, or the way I think Nginx Ingress currently does that is it creates an upstream pool for each route. So each route gets an upstream pool, which sort of defeats the purpose of having that service abstraction.
Yeah, I think this is definitely worth thinking about if like we have a one-to-one sidecar name map to service entity that somehow contains this, if that makes sense. Right now it feels wrong to just shove it into like the forward to section. It feels like we're gonna get into major problems there. But that was one thing that came to mind, is sort of extending service, but on the side.
Yeah, I agree. Any other thoughts, missing items, feedback around this one?
I think it looks great, Harry. The one thing I did want to mention was the thing that I have found with Contour is that before I started being a maintainer for an Ingress controller, which is also a proxy, I didn't realize the extent to which lots of people use the proxy as the point to fix up things. Timeouts is a great example of that. But there are other things, retry behavior and a lot of the other stuff you've talked about. A lot of people will use the proxy as the place where you fix that up. And some people want to be able to enforce things there. Some Contour users, although we allow people to set infinite request timeouts, some Contour users specifically don't want their users to be able to set that, and some other things like that. So there's a surprising amount of fiddliness about timeouts is, I guess, the thing I'm trying to say.
Path rewriting is another canonical example of people patching things up at the proxy layer.
Yeah. So that's, I think, so I agree with that. I think that definitely needs to be at the proxy layer, but it's about, path handling and path rewriting is a little tricky because some people want to do that at the matching layer and some people want to do at the service layer. But so the RBAC model is a whole separate issue that I think that is not discussed in this issue.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but I do get what you're trying to say here.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to, while it was in my head, I just wanted to remind everyone that that's something that I have been surprised at the extent to which it is an issue. Like, we have had multiple people fork Contour so that they could add those features on top of Contour.
I see. So people still probably want it at the per service level, but not the service author is the one setting it, or they want to quash it.
Yeah. So some people want the. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I use the right personas. I can't remember if we call it cluster admin or the gateway admin. Sometimes has different wants than what the application developer does. sometimes the gateway admin wants to like rein in what the application developer can do. Because if you're running a sort of centralized proxy, maybe you don't want people to have, for example, you don't want people to have to allow infinite request timeouts. You don't want your proxy to get busy holding open a bunch of connections that are no longer required because someone didn't know what they were doing and set an infinite request timeout for everybody. That's the sort of thing. That's the sort of thing where you run into that problem.
Do you think it's more of a, like, here's some basic policies, and then you have to sort of, if you fall outside these bounds, we're going to sort of take you back in? Or do you think people are also using it as a sort of like a AOP programming kind of thing where they just want to inject rules from the side because it's easier?
I think it's both, actually. Like, yeah, sometimes some people use it to sort of enforce a policy, say, and one of the requests we have outstanding for Contour that we haven't built yet is, that one of the reasons we haven't built it is, people want, external auth and rate limiting and things like that. And then some people want to be able to force everything that goes through that contour to have to use it. So you can't opt out of using it. And so, that's what I mean by sometimes the operator and the application developer will have like conflicting goals, and again, this is only in some cases, but the people who need it, they really need it, right? Like they're running in some constrained environment, regulatory constrained or some other constraint that the application developers may not know or care about, but the centralized team does know and care about them and needs to be able to make a way that the application developers can't inadvertently break things. Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to say here. Sorry, I've derailed the conversation a bit, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I think we can classify these. For example, it probably is like help check path. That's probably something that people won't be overriding, but perhaps like connection hold timeout is something that could potentially have a override. So there's some things that are definitely controlled 100% by the application author, and some probably you could make the argument is you could give it to application authors, but might be overridden.
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
Do you guys see like they actually override everything? Probably not. Like they don't. You don't necessarily care about everything.
Yeah, a lot of the people who've built this have built a generalized mechanism to be able to override everything, but they don't actually use all of it. But yeah, I think most of the time the things where this bites people the hardest and that they build it for everything is timeouts, timeouts, retry behavior, and limits on open connections and requests. Those like resource management, basically so centralized proxy resource management are the main things where where the centralized operator will want to override what the application developers can do, or put limits around what the application developers can do. You might say you can have it from X to Y, but anything outside those bounds is not valid.
So this is for anyone who's doing some sort of multi-tenant cluster. So anytime you have an organization which is built around having like a platform team that operates the cluster, and then application teams which deploy to the cluster, the platform teams, going to need these sorts of policy controls.
Yeah, and to go back to where I started this from, the other thing that platform team will need a lot of the time is that they will need the ability to fix things that application teams have done in a let's be real and say a broken way. Sometimes people move applications onto a platform and they don't have the roadmap or the resources to fix some broken behavior, and the proxy is the place where that gets fixed or mitigated in some other way.
Yeah, that's a very common ask, and we also haven't built that out yet in Kong. Right now, the way we advise, and this does not float very well always, but is using something like an open policy agent and like going that route, and that floats sometimes, while other times people have built like custom controllers to actually work around that. So.
Yeah, it seems hard to solve it generally because that's what Open Policy Agent will do for you. But we can definitely sort of bake in at least some small amount of stuff to get, some like 80% or something, 70%. But like if you like in all generality, it's probably very hard to solve at this layer.
Yeah, I agree. It's just the point I was trying to make was that it's important to keep that in mind, that it is a thing that we, even if we don't give people if it's not included in the spec specifically, it needs to not be excluded, if you understand what I'm saying. It needs to not be made impossible by the spec, but we don't have to make it required. It needs to be in the optional, possible space at least.
Okay, cool. I think I'm going to just add that conversation to the notes on that issue so we don't forget it, unless someone already did it for me.
Great, thanks. I think we have one last issue here to cover. And this is actually one that plays nicely into work that's already underway. But John raised an issue earlier today that I think we've talked about this in various ways, but that the current state of our route selector makes it very unclear what kind of routes it should select. And I believe we have at least one PR that addresses this partially. But just a heads up, I think that's the scope of this really. And I think we're already dealing with this. Any additional thoughts? I think this is already in the process of being handled.
In the listener's PR, I mentioned this issue, and I think I added a sentence like, the type of the routes must match the protocol, right? It's
right.
very, 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 very hand-wavy, and there's this implicit expectation that the routes are appropriate in some way, but it's currently just left to the gateway class to figure it out and have rules.
Yeah, and
I think in general this is a problem that we should give guidance around and try and tackle.
Yeah, and I think this
I think
also
like
came
the
up.
standard ones. Sorry, I think like the standard ones, like HTTP, like the ones that we're defining in the repo, we can definitely give very specific guidance, and then leaving some room for people to create their own, SCTP routing or something like that, or some custom, what is it, MQ protocol or something like for experimentation.
Yeah, and I think this also came up with the L4 work that Jeremy and Andrew had a proposal on, and that included a type reference that I can't remember where it was defined, but it specifically said what kind of resource this selector was intended for. So that did rule out the possibility of selecting multiple kinds of resources with a single route selector, but to me that seems reasonable.
I'm not sure that specifying the resource name fundamentally helps when you're flipping between gateway classes, because if you had the gateway class which supports the virtual service, then you would have put the virtual service resource in the selector, and then you flip the gateway class. It doesn't make it valid. It just, you're going to get the same, you're going to have the gateway class that now doesn't support virtual service is still going to have to, raise that error condition somehow.
Yeah. What it does avoid though is ambiguity on what the user intended to be selected, but especially if there are controllers or implementations that support a variety of different route types. This specifically came up in the idea of L4 potentially gateways being able to reference or services or TCP routes. And in that
I
case,
see. Let's see. I changed my create a HTTP route with label change by SDO. I see. So we should need to qualify it.
Yeah.
He's saying we need to qualify it with type, otherwise it's not specific enough.
Yeah, and I think this also has L4 implications if we are open to the proposal to link directly to service, which is a whole other can of worms. But if we have multiple L4 route types, then you would want to specify what kind of route you are selecting.
Yeah, so the devil's advocate a little bit, you can provide guidance in the spec, but the resources that the gateway class can consume in the way we build it now is up to the gateway class. So you don't actually need a spec change to say that you can put service resources here. The gateway class can just implement that.
Right, but what if let's say there are different kinds of routes with the same that would match that selector, but you really only want to target one of them, and
yeah,
your
I think
gateway implementation.
This is like there are very few, zero Kubernetes selectors across types, and then this is kind of what we're advocating for. So we probably just need to put a type, comma, selector. Is that?
I don't think that
like the most reductive way to summarize his thing, but it sounds like that's what he's saying.
Yeah, I think that if you have the if you have a kind selector as part of the route selector, like you just have a way to specify a kind. I'm not sure the best API way to do that, but if you have a way to specify a kind, then you can be clear. If the field is optional, then or something like then it's up to the, as James says, it's up to the controller implementer how they treat the field to some extent. I don't know, like I do think it does feel weird. I agree with him that it does feel weird to have a label selector that operates across multiple kinds. So if we're going to do that, then we need to have a good reason, and we need to explain that that's how it works.
Yeah,
it
like
is kind of weird from a. Sorry, go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, after you.
I think James, you were more passionate.
Okay, I wonder if the historical basis for this in Kubernetes is that it's annoying to write code to hit all the resource types. So when you have a selector which specifies a label but no resource type, it's super annoying because you have to poke the API server for all its resource types and set up multiple watches, and it's just a bunch of code.
A lot of watches as well.
Yeah, I just pasted the link
it's
to
like 50
issue
or so.
88, and issue 88 talks about that. It's important to the implementer to know what kinds do I need to watch.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it does make sense. We can put kind in there and see, and make it non-optional, and then see how it looks. It feels like the right thing, because otherwise you have these all these caches floating around potentially.
Yeah, and you're
Could
just starting a lot of informers for no good reason.
Could we have a list where each item is a selector and then a kind? Because you might want to select HTTP route as well as HTTPS route, or did we get rid of that? Well, it's conceivable you might want to select multiple kinds on the same listener or the same gateway.
Yeah, like this is worth just, I think it's a simple enough change. Just if someone wants to volunteer to do the initial PR to explore this.
I am interested in that idea though, that I guess part of this is defining how frequently we anticipate a user wanting to reference multiple route types as part of the same, like in a single gateway.
It seems at
And
first
if
blush
that-
to be very rare, but
Right. But my guy's example of HTTP and HTTPS route, if those are separate things, that could be.
but they
very
aren't
common.
separate right now.
Sure. Yeah.
So yes, if there was HTTP and HTTPS route, then maybe it would be more common. But right now we only have one description of HTTP level routing and one for TCP. It seems quite rare that someone would want a service that's like a HTTP, TCP, UDP, Swiss Army knife service.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess the question that I would ask is, which way is easier to go if we change our mind? If we put the list in, is it easier to go from a list to not a list, or is it easier to go like? Is there a cost? Is there an asymmetric cost of changing from one way to the other?
So there is a path to go from singular to plural, but it's annoying.
Okay, and how about the other way?
You mean from kind to resource? You mean?
No, I don't think that was what Bowie was talking about. Bowie means going from a list of selectors with associated kinds to a single selector with associated kind.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel
Yeah,
like
there's
it
a
would be.
path.
Yeah, I get it. So there is a path. Is there a path the other way to go from single to plural? I mean, Rob, you're
Yes,
the one
there's a-
who's had recent experience with messing with moving API types around. This is what I mean. Like, you know, if we're like we don't know, then it feels to me like the obvious thing to do is to look at how hard the change would be to make, and do the thing. If we're not sure, then you do the thing that's going to be easier to change your mind on later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
singular to
it's-
plural, the path is well trod. But Rob can comment, it's kind of annoying. I mean, you can do it.
Right. It's annoying, but I don't think there is much of a path from plural to singular.
Right. So in that case, we're
Backing
better off
up
starting
a
with
moment.
singular and adding plural if we need it.
Would it be a common use case to have a gateway that selects, for example, HTTP route as well as maybe OpenShift's route type or Contour's HTTP proxy type? Would it make sense to have a gateway that selects all of these custom variants of the same, essentially the same type?
So the thing is, like, one thing is, let's say you do that, if you left it as singular, you're just having like a list of 3 things versus one thing. It seems to be not that, like, you're trying to make it more concise, I guess.
What it does, I think,
feels
depend
premature.
on. I think it depends on the listener model a bit. So in the current model that's committed, you just have routes on an address more or less. And I think in that world, maybe having selecting different kinds of routes makes more sense. And you might say, oh, okay, I do want to select an HTTP proxy route and a HTTP route and an OpenShift route. With the listener proposal, arguably that makes less sense, because then the routes can be bound to a host name or a domain, and in that case, because you have that binding up front, I think it probably makes less sense, because you'd probably say, well, for this name, at that point you're more likely to know that a name is configured with HTTP route or a name is a TCP route, and you have that name binding to make the routing more concrete.
I keep on thinking back to the L4 example right now. Oh yeah, we're at time. But I just one last thing. I thinking of the L4 example of wanting to reference a service directly, and alternatively wanting to reference a TCP route for traffic splitting or any other functionality. I could see that being a thing you might want to do within the same gateway or gateway listener. But it seems like there's lots more discussion to be had here. So maybe we can follow up on that issue. That was the latest issue filed today, 197. So plenty to follow up with there. And the one item I had left today, I will push till tomorrow. But don't want to keep anyone any later than we already have. So thanks so much to everyone for coming out.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Sam.
See ya.